Good afternoon. This is really quite an honor to be here. As Professor Allett mentioned, I started my career here, and when I put my glasses on, I can see colleagues I've had for over the last 25 years, and I'm really quite flattered that they would come for this lecture. And so let's go ahead and get into it. I'm told that I'm supposed to talk for approximately 45 minutes, and then there'll be 15 minutes of question and answer. I will try to stick to the script, and we should get through it in 45 minutes. Professor Allett's going to flag me down if I don't. But even as we do that, please feel free to raise a hand and ask a question as I'm going. And you might see why that would be necessary, and that Professor Allett asked me to talk about great books in African American literature, and when I sat down to think about, okay, great books in African American literature, ultimately what came out of my head was a condensed version of the last couple of classes I've been teaching, moving from the end of the 18th century to now. So I'm going to be moving fairly quickly, going to give you all some larger concepts that hopefully coordinate some of these writers and authors, but it's going to move fairly quickly, and so if there are certain things that aren't made clear, please ask me. Before I start with the history and analysis proper, I'd like to say that it makes sense to think, well, before getting into a closer look at important books, writers, ideas, and the historical events shaping all three, it's well worth noting the historical complexity, indeed the deeply conflicted relationship between African Americans and the technology of reading and writing, otherwise known as literacy, and to print culture in a larger sense. For much of the era of slavery in North America, blacks were legally barred from learning to read and to write, and found it exceedingly difficult to enter the world of print culture, even if an individual or a specific community gained that technology. This is a point to which I'll return momentarily, but it's well worth the effort to point out at the outset in order to underscore the exceptional nature of the authors and books I'm about to review, and to gesture to additional ways to study and to understand the communities that these texts represent. We can think about African American literature or the African American literary tradition as attempting to address three questions. Now, I'm trying to move quickly, and this is somewhat reductive, but I think that it has some power in its framing ability. One, how does one prove black personhood and black humanity? Two, how does one claim a public voice? And three, how does one address a skeptical audience that assumes the author's inability to communicate complex ideas? With these three questions in mind, I'm going to walk through essentially 8 eras. First, the early letters, late 18th century. 2, the turn of the 19th century and the rise of the black polemic. 3, the classic era of the slave narrative, and I'm going to have to revisit that title for that epoch, but it'll have to serve for now. The postbellum literature and the quest for the mainstream. The New Negro movement / the Harlem Renaissance, the indignant generation, and I take that title from a former colleague of mine here, Lawrence Jackson, who's now at Johns Hopkins University. 7, the Black Arts movement / African American studies moment, and then the contemporary moment. It's important to articulate also the defining idea that I will rely on to read and interpret the history of African American writing, that literacy and freedom are deeply intertwined. Indeed, to borrow from Robert Steptoe, that African Americans pursue writing and print culture as a means of pursuing freedom. For the African American, one cannot have one without the other. So too, Henry Louis Gates Jr. makes the cogent argument that for the earliest moments of African American writing in the New World, literacy was inextricably linked to the notion of reason. That reading, and particularly writing, were the very signs of reason for Western culture of the Enlightenment era, and thus blacks and their supporters promoted literacy and the production of literature by African Americans as a means of proving black personhood, agency, and perhaps citizenship, a notion that is absolutely essential to this first moment of African American writing. All righty. So we have here Phyllis Wheatley. African American writing essentially begins at the end of the 18th century, just as these three fledgling colonies, literally on the outback of the British Empire, has the nerve to think about going to war against literally the global power of the moment. Not just going to war just to go to war, but under the banner of liberty, equality, and popular government. Thus, in 1773, an enslaved black woman published the first volume of poetry written by an African American in the New World. Poems of various subjects, religious and moral. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, no. I've skipped ahead. I don't have a visual for the volume.
That one should take you back, I think.
Well, that's all right. It's not on here. But you can see it. The first edition, Randall, correct me if I'm wrong, is actually here at the Rose Library. Randall, is that still true? So you can see the very first book written and published by an African American in the New World here at Emory University, 1773, poems of various subjects, religious and moral. Phyllis Wheatley was born in 1753 in Senegal, enslaved approximately 1761, and bought by John Wheatley in Boston to be a servant for his wife. Once she got to Boston, it was very clear that she was quite precocious as a child, and so this Wheatley family educated her along with the rest of the children of the family, and so she grew up and learned Greek and Latin and the British neoclassicists, Alexander Pope, etc. And we can see this in her title, as the title suggests, a collection of poems, mostly elegies, addressing pressing issues of the day, particularly the American Revolution and leading political and religious figures shaping public opinion. Written in a neoclassical style, replete with Greek mythological references, the volume clearly demonstrates a mastery of the Western tradition of letters and languages. Indeed, Wheatley had to appear in front of a skeptical panel of community leaders to prove that this enslaved black woman had in fact written the volume. I've skipped ahead again, I must have touched it. But this is actually from the frontispiece of her volume. This group included Thomas Hutchinson, who was then the governor of Massachusetts, both John Hancock and Benjamin Rush, who would go on to sign the Declaration of Independence. She basically had to be interviewed and to prove that, in fact, that she had written this book. This group went on to basically write a letter of authentication that opens the volume to say that, in fact, yes, we interviewed this black enslaved woman, and she wrote this volume. Critics have come to call this kind of documentation authentic documents or authenticating documents. And we see this across much of 19th century African American letters. addressing one of the questions that I posed to you. How is it that a black writer addresses a skeptical audience, an audience that assumes one's intellectual inferiority? And this is one of the strategies, actually having a black voice, or, a white voice, or a set of white interlocutors to actually write and say, to vouch for the veracity of this black quasi-speaking subject who's in question. Here, Gates's notion of literacy and proof of reason is brought to bear here in a very overt way. Thomas Jefferson and others had said that blacks were incapable of reason and of producing real literature. Here, the Wheatley family and the Duchess of Huntington, I'll get to her in a second, her benefactors could point and say, here's proof positive that this is not the case, that indeed blacks can produce fine literature and that they are indeed rational human beings. Now, Wheatley makes a series of innovations for black letters in terms of addressing these three questions that I've posed to you, and I think these are well worth noting. How does an enslaved black woman have the authority to speak or write in order to address an audience? By convention and perhaps by law. As a woman, as a black person, and as an enslaved person, she has no access to the public sphere. She has, at least by custom, no access to a public voice. I'm going to read to you a short poem in heroic couplets, no less, on being brought from Africa to America. And I think it starts to answer this question. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew, some view our sable race with scornful eye. Quote, their color is a diabolical dye, end quote." That's a quote within the poem. "Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train." That's the end of the poem. Now, until very recently, and when I say very recently, until the moment where black feminist critics went back and started revising the original canon that was constructed by the first architects of African American studies, and time permitting. I'll get to that once I get to epoch number 7. Before that moment, Phyllis Wheatley had been dismissed because with a very quick reading of this poem and other like it, you could read that she's saying, well, I am black and therefore inferior, but thank goodness I was enslaved and Christianized. Now I'm in this Christian country and can enjoy the blessings of Jesus Christ. That's certainly one reading, and for those first black aesthetic and black arts architects, that was beyond the pale. But she's gone under a radical revision, and one that looks at the way in which she claims Christian identity as a means of addressing an audience that otherwise would dismiss her as a black enslaved woman who therefore cannot speak. 3 things that she is able to do through her Christian identity. 1, she can say, I'm obeying the will of God. God gave me this talent. I'm writing these poems and I'm addressing you, believers, out of the spirit of Christian fellowship. 2, there's an ongoing debate at the end of the 18th century, well towards into the middle of the 19th century, as to whether blacks had souls to begin with, and therefore whether they could be saved. Phyllis Wheatley is saying unequivocally, I've got a soul. All of us have souls, even blacks with that as black, sable, and with the curse of Cain, all are capable of salvation. And then number 3, her claim to salvation, by extension, is a claim to equality within the body of Christ. All believers, all who are saved, and therefore are part of a community that, according to the Scriptures, doesn't observe differences according to race or gender or class. And this is an implicit claim that will become explicit later, and I'll get to it in a moment. There's one other point that's important to make here relative to Wheatley. And yes, I am going to have to speed up if I'm going to get through 200 more years of this history, right? All right, so the Huntington Connection. John Wesley, George Whitefield, 2 major architects for British and American Methodism, and the Countess of Huntington and her supporters all got together to advance black salvation through Methodist conversion. They provided funding for publications written by blacks as proof of black intellectual capability as an example of conversion. And there are a host of black writers right at the end of the 18th century who are part of this Huntington Connection. John Morant, his A Narrative of the Lord's Wonderful Dealings with John Morant, a black, 1785. Olodu Equiano, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olodu Equiano, 1789. You might know him as Gustavus Vasa. These autobiographies and others recounted conversion, the acquisition of literacy, and encounters with slavery. And I say encounters in that not all of these writers were actually enslaved. And technically speaking, these are not slave narratives yet. I'm not going to explain that statement. If you want me to, you have to ask me about it during the Q&A. But these aren't quite slave narratives yet, historically speaking. All in the name of conversion and the demonstration of intellectual capacity on the part of the African American. All posit Christian identity as the basis of authority. They claim the ability of blacks to be saved, to interpret Scripture, and to convert, thus equality in the body of Christ, and an implicit claim to political equality, a claim that will become explicit in the 19th century. Oh, I should have. This is Equiano. And this is the frontispiece to his narrative. All righty, so that is the end of the 18th century. And now we're moving into the second era, the turn of the 19th century, and the rise of the black polemic. This is the frontispiece of David Walker's appeal. Moving on to David Walker's appeal at the end of the turn of the 19th century. The full title is David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. Walker lived from 1796 to 1830. This was published in 1829. It called for black insurrection and condemned the United States as a hypocritical nation that bastardized Christianity by using it to justify slavery. By way of kind of filling out part of his career, it's important to note for David Walker that he also was a writer for Freedom's Journal. Freedom's Journal was the first black newspaper and came into existence in 1827 and existed through 1829. And he was very active up and down the Eastern Seaboard, but at the end of his life, particularly in Boston, in helping newly freed blacks establish themselves in the Northeast. David Walker's appeal is important for lots of things. I'm going to reduce them to 3. One, we have the first inklings in African American letters of liberation theology, where Walker says explicitly, God loves black people and he wants them to be free. And I say he, when I refer to God, that's Walker, that's not Sanders. If it were my language, I'd be like her or he, she, or it, but that's him. He wants black people to be free because he loves them. 2, he uses the Jeremiad, which is not new to American letters, and if you don't know what a Jeremiad is, again, you're going to have to ask me during the Q&A. But it is new to African American letters, and when he takes this older Puritan rhetorical form and applies it to slavery to say, look, slavery is at variance with God's will. And if you continue with it, you are going to bring down the wrath of God on this supposedly God-fearing nation. And number 3 for the appeal, Walker makes, to my understanding, the first really secular claim to authority in terms of authority to speak publicly. Despite the religiously based arguments against slavery, at the end of the day, this black man writing to an audience that's kind of on the fence at best about this institution of slavery in 1829. I do need to say a little bit something more. Again, this is for undergraduates, about kind of where we are in the history of slavery. I'll say that in a second. But despite those the religious-based arguments against the institution of slavery, his authority to speak is not out of a sense of Christian identity. And he never claims that for himself in an overt sense. He claims it as a patriot. He says, I'm more American than those slaveholders. They're the anti-patriots. They're the anti-Americans because they uphold an institution that by definition is anti-democratic. I, and by extension, black people, are the real patriots, are the real Americans. Now, I said something about kind of where we are in the history of slavery. It's important to keep in mind, as we look back, we kind of think about slavery as this kind of monolith. It almost died on the vine in the United States by the end of the the end of the 18th century. And it really was Eli Whitney and the cotton gin that gave the technology for the production of cotton that made possible this kind of, this new gross cash crop, this largely produced cash crop in the South, and that created all this new demand for cheap labor, et cetera. And that's pretty much common knowledge. What we don't think about either, we don't tend to think about in the American Academy in 1829 is that hemispheric-wide, the institution of slavery is in real trouble too. The Spanish Empire is crumbling, and all of these new colonies that are striking for independence, one of the first things they do is to abolish slavery. And so, certainly by the time we get to the 1840s, and we'll be there in just a minute, those southern slaveholders, those southern planters, politically speaking, as far as the institution of slavery is concerned, are the outliers relative to the larger hemisphere. And this is not lost on black writers of the moment. David Walker is very, very aware that the tide of history is on his side. And he's writing not just to African Americans, but I'm probably spending too much time on this, but he was a seafarer. He grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, a free black in Wilmington, North Carolina, and was on ships up and down the eastern seaboard. And he used to distribute his pamphlets, this appeal, to ship builders or to mariners, both black and white. And so it would circulate not just up and down the eastern seaboard, it would circulate in the Caribbean, and it would circulate in South America too. Also, what we lose sight of from our perspective that certainly African Americans were aware of at the turn of the 19th century is just the impact, well, not just African Americans, but slaveholders too, the impact of the Haitian Revolution. That's 1791 to 1804. 1804, we get the establishment of a black republic, the first black republic in the New World, based on a slave rebellion. It was the most lucrative colony in the New World, producing sugar at a rate as a third of the island of Hispaniola, producing more sugar per capita than was produced in Brazil. I mean, it was the gem of the French Empire. And they struck for independence. It took a long time, but they got their independence, and it sent a shockwave across the slave-holding world in the New World. That's a little redundant. You see, I'm off script now, but I'm going to get back to it. as time is going by. But that backdrop is enormously important, and one that David Walker and his devotees were very much aware of as well. Speaking of a devotee, exactly at this moment, it's well worth mentioning Maria Steward. I don't have a slide for her, but she was circulating in Boston, giving public speeches at exactly the same time. Walker dies in 1830, and she is coming onto the scene right at the end of the 1820s and into the 1830s. Her big volume was Religion and the Pure Principle of Morality, the Sure Foundation on Which We Must Build. And she gave a number of public lectures, particularly at the African Meeting House on Joy Street in Boston. And those lectures actually are collected in a volume if you want to read more. She talked about black self-help, education, and religious rectitude. And she anticipates black feminism of the 20th century in her claim to black female agency and a black female public voice. Era number 3, the classic era of slave narratives. Now, when I wrote this, when using the word classic, I was referring to kind of this moment where we have a burgeoning body of African-American autobiographical writing, which we tend to call slave narratives. And the form or all of what we look for in slave narratives comes from this moment. But classic also has this kind of romantic ring to it. And so when I was rereading these notes this morning, I wanted to edit that because I don't want to suggest that this is somehow a glorious time. It's probably one of the worst times to be black in this country. Part of, in and around Frederick Douglass, to whom I'll address momentarily, there were writers such as William Wells Brown. His narrative of William Wells Brown, A Fugitive Slave, written by himself, that came out in 1847. Josiah Henson, The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, now an inhabitant of Canada, as narrated by himself. Josiah Henson, if you've read Uncle Tom's Cabin or if you've heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin, he was one of the models or forms that Harriet Beecher Stowe called on to create her Christian hero, Uncle Tom. There was Henry Box Brown, the narrative of Henry Box Brown, who escaped from slavery and closed in a box, 1849. And I really should have had a slide of this because that frontispiece is actually funny, where he's springing out of this box. He actually mailed himself to freedom. Right in the middle of this is the runaway bestseller of the moment, Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, An American Slave. Yes, that's supposed to be oxymoronic. Abolitionist, orator, founder of the North Star, a black abolitionist newspaper, supporter of women's suffrage. He went to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 and supported women's suffrage. He was the writer of 2 additional autobiographies, My Bondage and My Freedom and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. He published the first black novella titled The Heroic Slave. He was a diplomat, and he is kind of a public figure, political and literary, that just strides across the entire 19th century. We could do the whole 45 minutes on him. But the 1845 narrative is enormously important because it really changes the language of African American slave narratives and addresses those 3 questions in dramatically different ways than previous slave narratives had addressed them. The first way, actually, is consistent. We've already seen it in Phyllis Wheatley, this notion of authentication. You open the narrative, and the first thing you see are these introductions, one by Wendell Phillips and the other by William Lloyd Garrison, each one saying essentially the same thing. We can vouch for him. he wrote this? And that was a real question specifically for him. In fact, he wrote it because prior to writing it, he was out on the circuit, the lecture circuit for abolitionists, and his audience would get up and say, "You weren't a slave because you're too eloquent. You talk too well." And so he kind of got off the lecture circuit for a while to sit down to write his own narrative, and then went back on the circuit, went to England, came back, and did all kinds of other work supporting abolitionism. Douglass's approach to creating a black rhetorical self that's going to be convincing and persuasive for this skeptical white audience is somewhat different, dramatically different from what we see before. He makes overt and clear this link between literacy and freedom. Part of his maturation process is this process of self-education. He literally steals literacy from these other kind of street urchins who are in and around his neighborhood in Baltimore. For him, it is both the sign of personhood in a larger metaphoric sense, and because he could write a pass for himself, it's the actual mechanism for gaining his freedom. His narrative references earlier Christian conversion narratives, but not in the sense of claiming Christian identity for himself, but in that it replicates the essential transition from sin to salvation, now in largely secular terms. We have the iconic movement from south to north, from slave to free, from death to life, from ignorance to knowledge, from illiteracy to literacy, from object to speaking subject. Or to put it another way, the movement from damned to saved is now a secular assertion of a new black citizen patriot. Douglass is a self-reliant, self-made man who embodies the ideals of the founding documents for the Republic. This does not appear in any of these books, but I just wanted to kind of present you with this. It's an iconic photograph. Many of you all have seen it before, but it gives a kind of a physical sense of the brutality that this institution exacted on its victims, and certainly something to which Douglass is referring. Dramatically different from Douglass, but equally as important as Harriet Jacobs, 1813 to 1897. Her Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl comes out in 1861, just as the nation is getting ginned up for this apocalyptic conflict. But she sets herself up in talking about her experience as a slave and her strike for freedom in dramatically different terms than that previous corpus, but particularly in opposition to how Douglass asserts himself. Has anybody read Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl? I assume that some of you all have. What is particularly striking about this book, one is the way in which she conceives freedom. If Douglass conceives freedom as this sense of ultimate autonomy, that physically being away from that institution, Jacobs suggests freedom in community. She refuses to leave the South without her children. She cannot conceive of freedom without the rest of her family. And so what she does is literally invent and inhabit a liminal space, a physical liminal space, somewhere between slavery and freedom. And it's a garret, an attic in her mother or grandmother's house. And she stays there for 7 years, long enough for her to figure out how she could get herself and the rest of her family out of slavery. She also, if you read Douglass, at least on the surface, there's no sex. If you kind of do some digging, you can find some sex. For Jacobs, she weaponizes her sexuality quite literally. She's under threat of being raped by her owner. I say owner, and technically he's not her owner. It's the father of her owner. Her owner is actually her own age. But he starts making sexual advances towards her when she's about 15 years old. And to thwart these sexual advances, she takes up with a landed, a wealthy white man in the neighborhood and has 2 children by him. And she makes a very overt, self-conscious decision to become this man's concubine, as opposed to being subject to the sexual abuse of her master, as it were. By doing so, by really talking quite overtly, particularly in a Victorian era, about her sexuality, Jacobs challenges what has come to be called this cult of true womanhood and the assurance of what the domestic novel suggests in terms of the peace and refuge of that domestic space. That hearth and home provide protection and enduring meaning for the pious woman. Indeed, Jacobs turns this on its head and is addressing this white New England-based female audience to say that for me to have the same privileges of femininity that you have, then I have to be free, because this is the way in which all slave women are abused. This is the way all slave girls are subject to sexual abuse and being potentially separated from their families. So this is the frontispiece of the 1861 Incidents of Slave Girl. It's important that below that I didn't read it. It said, written by herself. It's 10 after 5. I'm supposed to, 5:15?
5:20.
All righty. I'm in the middle of the 19th century. All righty. We'll see what happens. The next, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Now we're in the postbellum literature, the era of the postbellum literature, and the quest for the mainstream. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper may well be the most prolific African-American woman in the 19th century, a woman that most of you all have not heard of, but she was really, really quite prolific. And I'm not going to list everything, but poems on miscellaneous subjects: Moses, A Story of the Nile; Iola Leroy, or Shadows of Uplift are 2 of her more better-known works. And I think Moses, A Story of the Nile, is really interesting because she retells in blank verse. This is an epic poem in blank verse. She retells the story of Moses from the perspective of Miriam, and so she places this Hebrew woman at the center of this drama, and I think it has kind of proto-black feminist implications. Moving right along, we have Elizabeth Keckley. I couldn't come here and not mention Elizabeth Keckley because she has come back into critical discourse because of a former colleague of mine, Frances Smith Foster, who was here for many years and retired just a while ago. If you go back and look for Behind the Scenes, which was Elizabeth Keckley's best-known work, all of the critical work and its revival is largely due to Frances Smith Foster. I frame this in terms of this quest for the mainstream. This is the first moment where black writers are writing now to address a growing audience that is looking for entertainment. This is no longer writing with an overt polemic in mind, specifically the abolition of slavery. This is a post-bellum era. The institution is gone. There are lots of problems. I don't have time to go into either Reconstruction or its dismantling, but that's the historical moment that we're in. But we also have a moment where black writers can actually access what we would now call the mainstream, and indeed they start to publish in mainstream publications like Harper's and Atlantic Monthly, actually national magazines, which is an entirely new phenomenon, a post-bellum phenomenon in the United States. And so writers such as Paul Laurence Dunbar and Charles Chestnut begin writing in these magazines and begin getting writing contracts with quote-unquote mainstream publishers. But there's a problem. There's a catch. The public really wants minstrelsy and dialect. I can't go into the history of minstrelsy and dialect, but suffice it to say that these are theatrical and literary forms that deliver up black stereotypes, that deliver up blacks as essentially buffoons and children. These flattening out stereotypes. Literarily, it's usually delivered through dialect. Paul Laurence Dunbar was both a fiction writer and a poet. In his poetry, he wrote what we call dialect poetry, and he wrote poetry in standard English, or what we would call standard English. And the dialect poetry, because of its longer tradition, wedded to minstrelsy, often delivered these similar kinds of stereotypes. But that was the ticket. That was the way to address a mainstream audience. And by the end of Paul Laurence Dunbar's career, he really regretted that. There's just a wrenching quotation in along this way, James Weldon Johnson's autobiography. He was a very good friend of Paul Laurence Dunbar, and he quotes Dunbar as saying, is that this was the trap that I found myself in that I couldn't get out of. This is a frontispiece for one of his earlier works, Lyrics of Lowly Life. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. One of his later novels, Sport of the Gods. I didn't know kind of what the space would be, so I actually brought a first edition of Sport of the Gods, but time won't allow, and we can't kind of pass it around. But perhaps at some other point you can see that. And then his compatriot, kind of contemporary, is Charles Chestnut, who has a number of novels. Perhaps his most famous collection is The Conjure Woman, and this is a really good example. You've all heard of Uncle Remus, I assume. Joel Chandler Harris's speaker for Songs of the South. Almost in response to Songs of the South, Chestnut writes The Conjure Woman with the protagonist, as it were, Uncle Julius. And then supposedly, this frontispiece, I suppose, is supposed to be a representation of Uncle Julius. And so much of it is about conjuring, that is kind of black magic, as it were, and a lot of it has to do with the use of rabbit's feet, so I assume that's why the rabbit are here. Chestnut faced the same problem. How is it that you write in a minstrel tradition or a plantation tradition and actually deliver some more complex sense of black humanity? And this, I'm not going to answer that question. That is the dilemma that he faced. All righty. If you'll give me 5 more minutes, I am going to give you the Harlem Renaissance, the area that is my area of expertise, and then I'm going to jump to the contemporary moment because I just have to say something about a former colleague of ours who is just kind of part and parcel, kind of representative of the hope of this modern moment. We jump forward to the turn of the 20th century, the New Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance. There are a number of writers. I mean, it's just a burgeoning moment of writers, of thinkers, artists, performing artists. The music scene, particularly in New York and Chicago, is basically the foundation of popular music across the 20th century into the modern moment. I would go far to say I can't explain it, but I'll go so far to say is those of you all who are hip-hop fans, you have hip-hop because of this moment. This is the moment that takes black urban vernacular and reshapes it in a way that delivers something that's closer to the way in which black people actually talk, and delivers it to both black and white audiences in a way that people really want to keep listening to it. So Duke Ellington, Jelly Roll Morton, Fletcher Henderson, Bessie Smith, on and on and on. Shuffle Along, I'm Just Wild About Harry, two Broadway productions that were just runaway smash hits, and that creates all of this uproar about black expressive culture, attracts a lot of money, particularly in Manhattan. And so we have this kind of groundswell, and we have opportunity for writers such as Gene Toomer, Zora Neale Hurston, County Cullen, and Spencer, Claude McKay, on and on. But indeed, and Langston Hughes in particular, perhaps as the ultimate embodiment of this moment, in the way in which he, through poetry and prose, makes possible the modern moment of African American literature. Three publications for this moment, I think, help to illustrate quite well what's going on. One would be The Souls of Black Folk, here by W.E.B. Du Bois. It's a collection of essays that champions this notion of culture and education as a means of black advancement. Very clearly a support for HBCUs, as historically black colleges and universities, an affirmation of African American folk culture in a way of understanding it as a means of sustaining African American life, and reflects a certain African American intellect. At the same time, while the collection stresses black leadership as a product of these educational institutions, what Du Bois comes up with this notion of the talented 10th, and thus the importance of liberal arts education. He also forges this concept of double consciousness that will reverberate across the entire century of African American letters. If you've read Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, which I might not have time to talk about, but we'll see. If you've read James Weldon Johnson's The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, in many ways, they are kind of fictionalized accounts of this phenomenon of double consciousness. Du Bois also wrote Black Reconstruction in America that came out in 1935, I'm sorry. Often not cited as a kind of representative text for this moment, but I think it's overlooked at our peril. And this is why. We're all children of this book, whether you've read it or not. And I assume that like 99% of us have not. I did. But it would never be assigned to you because it would just take over the entire class. Patrick's an historian. He's probably read it as well. But prior to Black Reconstruction in America, we had this Dunning School. And Reconstruction was an enormously important moment in American history. And looking back from the 20th century into the 19th and kind of understanding why is it we went to war with one another, what good did it do? The Dunning School said, well, it really was an awful moment. And Reconstruction was even worse because all of these blacks took over these legislatures in the South and just ran amok. Luckily, patriots like Klan members came out, intimidated, got rid of these people, and restored the South to its previous glory. That was the official historical accounting of Reconstruction before Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America. I'm sure you've never read any histories out of the Dunning School, but many of you all have seen at least clips of Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is a cinematic representation of the Dunning School approach to Reconstruction. It's Du Bois that rewrites all of that. And all historians since then, if you've read anything about Reconstruction, you've probably read some of Eric Foner. He has a big book on Reconstruction, then he has a little book on Reconstruction. Eric Foner has new documentation, new sources, but the basic framing for his approach to Reconstruction comes right out of Du Bois. And Du Bois says no, he rejects that position entirely and says that indeed this was the moment where the United States actually could live up to its founding ideals and fails miserably. The third book is Their Eyes Were Watching God, 1937. I know someone here has read Their Eyes Were Watching God. Zora Hurston. Do I have? That's Hughes. Here's Hurston. Okay. Hurston's important for at least two reasons. One, this is a novel that reclaims from that dialect tradition black folk speech and delivers. Hurston was an anthropologist and actually studied quite closely black vernacular, local black vernacular, and so she is able to reproduce it in a number of her books. Their Eyes Were Watching God, perhaps being the best known. And so we have a manner of speech on the part of blacks that's not stereotypic at all. It's highly phonetical. You have to kind of read it out loud to kind of get a sense of it, and then you can just kind of read it at your own pace. But it's a manner of speech that delivers fully realized and complex black personas, not ones that are flattened out in the service of stereotyping. That's the first, one important point for Their Eyes Were Watching God. The second one is that she gives us this black female protagonist who works her way across this southern landscape and through three marriages in order to arrive at a moment of self-reclamation and to arrive at her own voice. It's only after she has literally killed her last husband that she can tell her own story. That has all kinds of feminist implications. At the moment, it's the context is a kind of first wave feminism, but the way in which it's been recovered is largely in service to the way, it's been recovered largely because Their Eyes Were Watching God anticipates so much of second wave feminism and so much of what will happen with black feminism of the 1970s and 80s. I am out of time, and I haven't even gotten to World War II. But that's all right. I understand there are other things that need to happen. I'm not going to keep talking. Well, hold on just a second. There are several more epochs, and I can't go through them. But there's the indignant generation. There's black arts, and then there's beyond black arts that gets us to our modern moment. We can at least look at Natasha Trethewey. We can. Here she is. I've got several. We've got black and white. We've got color. Natasha Trethewey, I think, well represents the moment where we are now. And she's not alone. Rita Dove, Edward P. Jones, Colson Whitehead, Edwidge Dandicott, Natasha Trethewey, Charles Johnson, Tracy Smith, Elizabeth Alexander, Kevin Young, Jericho Brown. If you haven't taken a class with Jericho Brown, I would try to as hard as I could. He's a wonderful professor and an even better poet, if that's possible. This is really a kind of second renaissance for African American literature, one that is absolutely burgeoning with talented people, and all of them are really, really young. So I anticipate that this moment is going to last for some time. I'm out of kind of my formal time, but please do let me entertain questions for as long as we have. Sir?
Thank you for this lecture. What's a Jeremiah? Does it have to do with the
Sure. That's a
literary structure of
yeah. That's a perfectly legitimate question. It comes out of the book of Jeremiah, and as you may well know, Jeremiah prophesies the Babylonian exile. He says, we're not observing the rituals in the way in which the Ten Commandments say, and if we don't start, God's going to rain down his wrath. And historically speaking, to my understanding, I'm not a biblical scholar, but to my understanding, though, my what we then called the Old Testament would now be a Hebrew Bible class. Jeremiah was actually written after the Babylonian exile, but it was a way in which, in the aftermath, for what would then be called, what was kind of newly formed Judaism, coming back from Babylonia and trying to re-inhabit Jerusalem, is a way of explaining, okay, what happened to us? And so kind of reading back or writing back into that moment prior to the Babylonian exile and saying, oh, well, God said that we shouldn't have done this, and we did it, and that's why we were exiled. Well, early in American letters, at the beginning of the 17th century, Puritans came up with a rhetorical strategy for calling particularly that second generation. When I say second generation, I'm saying American-born Puritans, those who didn't know their previous lives in Europe, calling them to return to the original vision for why they left Europe in the first place, to build this city on a hill, to be an example of what the Church of England should have been, but had fallen away from. And so it starts, and I know there are scholars here better than I who can speak to the history of the American Jeremiah. So if I'm wrong, please don't feel like you're stepping on toes and saying, hey, Sanders, it's not quite right. But it became a Puritan sermonic tradition to preach this, on the one hand, the statement about the falling away. It was a kind of three-part formula. A statement about where we are now, and we have fallen off. A statement about the past and what ideally the past was, where we should have remained in terms of the ideal state of worship. And then a prophesying the future. If we do not return to the past, then our future will be some kind of apocalyptic reckoning. That's a Jeremiah. Is that? Sir?
You talked about kind of like the black dialect, and then later on you mentioned hip hop too.
Yeah.
So do you think hip hop is more indicative of the first kind you talked about, the more stereotypical, playing up the stereotypes kind of
Yeah.
dialect, or the second type, like learning versus?
Wow, that's a really good question. My son has gotten me to start listening to Kendrick Lamar. I know I'm late to the party. I'm really, really late. But I'm teaching a class on African American poetry, 20th and 21st century African American poetry. And the first day of class, I didn't try to rap it, but I just read the text of DNA. And my students were like, oh, okay, well maybe we can stay in this class. Not too many people actually dropped the class. But I used it as an example of African American poetics that is not often claimed by the Academy, but to my sense is equally as legitimate as any other form of African American poetics. But it is complicated. The claim I was making was historical, not necessarily in terms of any sense of authenticity, which is when the historical claim is to say that this is the moment, largely through Gene Toomer, Langston Hughes, Sterling Brown, and Zora Neale Hurston, where black writers take black vernacular and rework it in a way in which they can see a broader range of humanity, or they can actually see these fully realized black psyches in a way that the flattening out of the stereotypes previous to them could not. This is all, but it was a risky thing in that prior kind of black writers who were had these kind of middle class strivings really wanted to write in standard English and represent middle class urban blacks. So much of this was anathema for them. But this is the moment that held the day. Those writers you've never heard of. You ever heard of County Cullen? You're not alone. I have, because I studied the period. But no one reads County Cullen. He's a wonderful example of the other side. It's Langston Hughes whom we read, and it's Langston Hughes who anticipates black arts. And I didn't get to talk about black arts, but black arts is really the moment, and I'm talking approximately 1966 through the early 70s, that relocates all of this to say blackness writ large is largely an urban phenomenon. And blackness has to represent the way in which black people inhabit these urban spaces. And so we have a number of poets, particularly the last poets, the group of poets who would do what we now call poetry slams and deliver this highly energetic form of performance for poetry in a idiomatic style that was reflective of black urban dialect or black urban vernacular. It's really at this moment, kind of in a larger sense, what we understand as being authentically black gets relocated to this urban space. Even for the Harlem Renaissance folk, the notion of the folk was largely rural-based, except for Hurston. She actually had a glossary for urban vernacular terms. But it was largely a kind of rural phenomenon. And that made sense because most of the population was in the South, but as a result of the Great Migration, much of that population moved to the urbanized Northeast, Midwest, and to California. And that's where a lot of the money in terms of recording, the recording industry was. And so we get the last poets. Commercially, they weren't that successful, but it's not, historically speaking, the leap from the time frame from the last poets to the first really commercially successful piece of rap. They didn't call it hip-hop then. You've probably never heard of it. It was the Sugar Hill Gang, Rapper's Delight. It's 1979. I have to say, yeah, I was in high school at the time. Maybe your parents were thinking about going to high school. But that was the kind of first commercial success for rap that would become hip-hop, and then we get all the rest. But my claim was a historical one. We hadn't had Langston Hughes in particular saying that this is the way black people talk, and we can represent this poetically. We wouldn't have had the ways in which that's reproduced at the Black Arts movement, and certainly if we hadn't had Black Arts and if we hadn't had the last poets in particular, we wouldn't have had hip-hop, or we wouldn't have it in the way we have it now. But that's not to say that the complications of commercialization are really, I know we have to go, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, so can I just finish the point? And, yeah, okay. And so it's an open question. And there's some ways, I listen to what my son puts on, and sometimes I'm like, we can't talk like that, Isaiah. And he's just like, Dad, it's just the way we're kind of trying to think about where we are. And so I'm not going to repeat stuff here, but I've got a 10-year-old son too, and I'm like, okay, there's things that we can't put in the auxiliary, right? Because it's just, and in some ways it does feed into a stereotype, and in other ways, for other people, it really is about a certain way of trying to kind of figure out, at least for my son, where he is in this world, and so he has to, so it makes sense to him.
If you're a member of one of the voluntary core classes, please remember to sign the sheets as you're leaving. And then join me in thanking Dr. Sanders.